Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be recapping Day 3 of the NHL Play-Ins as we moved on to some Game 2s in these play-in series. First up on the docket was the Hurricanes versus the Rangers. Of course, the Hurricanes did win Game 1 3-2. It was a game in which the Hurricanes were in control of for most of it, but the Rangers still managed to remain within one goal, so it was a wonder whether or not the Rangers could improve and potentially challenge the Hurricanes in this game too, but that would not end up being the case. The Hurricanes would once again be dominant throughout the majority of this game. It started off with a Svechnikov goal. It would be tied up by Panarin on a 5-on-3 to make it 1-1, and the Rangers were probably at their best in that first period, but then for the rest of the game it was all Hurricanes. A Svechnikov goal, his second, then Martinook, and then Svechnikov completing the hat trick, which was actually the first hat trick in Carolina Hurricanes franchise history in the playoffs, and this also dating back to their Hartford Whalers day. So impressive there from the young forward. Now, the good news for the Hurricanes after this game too, well, is basically everything. The forwards seem to be doing well, especially the top forwards like Svechnikov, like Sebastian Aho, all doing quite well for themselves, especially when compared to the Rangers' top forwards. The defense is remaining quite solid for the Hurricanes, though we knew that coming in it was going to be good. And the goaltending as well, Mrazek, even though he hasn't had to have been that great. In the first period when the Rangers were pushing, Mrazek did make a couple of very nice saves, and so basically everything seems to be going well for the Hurricanes. The only bad news you can point to is the fact that the Hurricanes have been quite undisciplined during these first couple of games. They gave the Rangers, I believe, 7 power plays in the first game, and I believe they had another 5 or so here tonight. The Rangers were only able to capitalize on a single one, and that was thanks to a 5-on-3, so it hasn't really burnt the Hurricanes at all, and it's still quite possible the Hurricanes can complete the sweep, but it is still something to look out for. If the Rangers really manage to pull things together, it might have something to do with the fact that they keep getting a lot of power plays. On the Rangers side of things, the good news is, well, it's kind of hard to find much good news. The forwards for the Rangers have been quite ineffective, which is strange, as that's not something you would have expected coming in. The defense for the Rangers wasn't particularly good this game either. The goaltending, while Lundqvist was quite solid in Game 1, he was a bit worse here in Game 2, and that brings up the question whether or not will Shesterkin actually be healthy for Game 3, and would he actually play if so? And so not a lot going for the Rangers on the good news, and I guess that brings you to the bad news, which is all of that. Zibanejad, who was so fantastic during the regular season, hasn't been doing much in this series. The same would go for Panarin. The bottom 6 for the Rangers is getting outplayed by the bottom 6 of the Hurricanes, and as I said, just really not much doing for the Rangers. They seem to be in the bleakest position out of all the teams thus far in these play-ins. Next was the Flames versus the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Jets managed to win 3-2. This came as a big surprise. Of course, the Jets were likely the worst team on the first night of the play-ins when they lost 4-1 to the Flames, and they ended up losing Mark Scheifele and Patrick Laine especially, or those two players especially, to injuries. So it was a wonder how the Jets would actually be able to come back, but they get a very good win for themselves. It started off with a goal from Harkins, a player who I hadn't heard of before this game. Then Lowry would make it 2-0. The Flames would actually be able to come back with goals from Lindholm and Sam Bennett, but in Ehlers' goal in the third period would close it out for the Jets as they'd get the close 3-2 victory. The good news for the Winnipeg Jets is Hellebuck continues to be very, very well, and the Jets really dug down deep to get this victory. I think a big thing is some of these more depth players for the Jets really doing well. Kyle Lowry, Andrew Kopp, both playing pretty successful hockey. This Harkins guy really stepping up in this game, getting that first goal, opening the scoring for the Jets, and unlike in the previous game, they actually managed to do well with that first goal instead of sort of falling apart like they had done. And so the Jets looking pretty good. On the other hand, the bad news for the Winnipeg Jets is, of course, still Scheifele, still Laine, both players still injured. And while there was a report that Scheifele's injury does not seem to be completely serious, so it doesn't seem like he's out extremely long term, that doesn't necessarily mean he will be back at some point during this series. Maybe if the Jets were to make it further on in the playoffs, he could return at some point. But whether or not Scheifele is coming back for the Flames series is certainly still up in the air and potentially even unlikely. And so the Jets will have to continue to dig down quite deep if they want to try and win this series. This first game was a good start, but they'll need a bit more. The good news for the Flames, well, is basically the bad news for the Jets, is the fact that the Flames coming into this series on offense, on defense, were pretty close on paper. Maybe they were at a slight disadvantage compared to what the Jets could bolster offensively, but now with Scheifele and Laine both out, the Flames seem to just be better on paper in that regard. And so while they were quite awful here today, they were probably the worst team on the day for day 3. There is certainly still some hope with the fact that the Jets are quite hampered by injuries and the Flames, well, they're not. And that is really what the bad news was for the Flames, is that they were just completely bad in this game. They had moments where I guess they were okay, and the fact that they did still almost win this game, sure, but the offense wasn't really there. Talbot, I guess, was okay. The defense so not a great game for the Calgary Flames, especially considering the circumstances, but they're certainly still in this series and they certainly still have a leg up. Next, that brings us to the Penguins versus the Canadiens. Of course, it was the Canadiens winning the first one in a huge upset in overtime. Here tonight, however, the Penguins would manage to tie up the series with the 3-1 victory. The good news for the Pittsburgh Penguins is that they continue to heavily outplay the Montreal Canadiens. They continue to do well, and also a pretty underappreciated storyline in this series. So many people talking about Carey Price doing so well for the Canadiens, which is of course true, is that Matt Murray, who has come in here for the Penguins after having a pretty bad regular season, almost losing his starting job to Tristan Jarry. He's been very good here in this series, not necessarily being challenged too much by the Montreal Canadiens, but still, Matt Murray doing well. He carried the Pittsburgh, maybe not carried, but he was a big part of the Penguins' first 2 Stanley Cup wins a few years ago, and he's going to try to do the same thing here this year, and it's been a good first 2 games for him. This started off with a Crosby goal, then a Zucker goal. Kotkaniemi was going to make it interesting with his, but then Gensel would close it out with the empty netter. Now that brings us to the bad news for the Penguins, is the fact that, just like Game 1, they only managed to score 2 goals on a manned net, and so while they managed to limit the Canadiens to just a single goal in this game, so they still got the victory, it can still be a bit worrying with the fact that the Penguins have not yet found a consistent way of getting pucks past Carey Price. We know that they can consistently outplay the Canadiens. We know that they have the possibility of winning, but Carey Price is always going to be that wild card factor, and the Penguins just, they're still struggling in that regard. And that brings you to the good news for the Canadiens, which is and will still remain, and likely as this series goes on will probably be the main good news for the Canadiens each time. It's Carey Price. He was great in the first game. He was great again here tonight. He potentially could have had the goal by Crosby, but I had absolutely no chance on the Zucker goal. Otherwise, he was basically the sole factor keeping the Canadiens alive in this game. Had he been more playing at an average level, the Penguins likely would have racked up the goals, but he's been very, very good for the Canadiens. The bad news, of course, is that the first game, that, they showed signs of life there in the overtime. It didn't really produce much here in the second game. They were pretty thoroughly outplayed for the majority of it. They certainly showed flashes, I guess, in the third period, but otherwise they just didn't look that good. This is probably the biggest mismatch in the playoffs in terms of play-in series, and so we'll see if Carey Price can continue to bail them out, because the Canadiens not looking so good by themselves. And that brings us to the final game of the night. That was between the Oilers and the Blackhawks, in which the Oilers won 6-3 after losing the first game 6-4. Probably the most fun game of these play-ins. The other ones are all really tight defensive matchups. The Oilers and the Blackhawks one quite open up, goals everywhere basically, and this game started off with 2 quick ones from McDavid, including his second one, which was just a beautiful goal, which is something that we've become accustomed to when it comes to Conor McDavid. After that, Patrick Kane made it 2-1. Then it was Ennis making it 3-1 Oilers, but the Blackhawks would fight back with 2 goals from Cuckoo and Mata. This would make it 3-3, but then the Oilers, they'd complete the hat-trick with Conor McDavid's 4th in these play-ins, I should say, and then James Neal as well as Chason would close it out for the Oilers. The good news for them is, of course, that they continue to rack up the goals. They now have an average of 5 goals over these 2 games, 4 in the first one, 6 here tonight. Conor McDavid seems to be completely activated offensively. His defensive game certainly leaves some things to be desired, but offensively he seems to just be all over it. And so really everything offensively seems to be clicking quite well for the Oilers. They brought it back here at even strength, which was a worry after that first game. The bad news for the Oilers is still that defensive play. As I said, this is probably the most fun series. There seems to be a lot of goals, and while that seems to be working in the advantage of the Oilers somewhat, this fact remains is that they did let in 6 to the Blackhawks just the other day. They let in another 3, which isn't the worst, but still not great. The Oilers probably need to just fill in a couple of their holes defensively, and they should be able to win the rest of this series. The good news here for the Blackhawks is they did manage to keep up with the Oilers a bit here. Yes, they did get away from them at the end when McDavid got that hat-trick goal and then a couple in the third period from Neal and Chason. But otherwise, they're going, tit for tat for the Blackhawks. I mean, when you look at the other matchup on the other side, the other conference, the Eastern Conference, between the 5th and 12th team, as I pointed out, the Penguins are just sort of dominant over the Montreal Canadiens, with Carey Price being sort of like the last beacon of hope for the Canadiens. But this one, it doesn't seem like as much of a mismatch between 5th in the Western Conference and 12th in the Western Conference. The Blackhawks certainly do have a fighting chance, and that's really something they're going to hold on to. And that first game was nice to get them a foothold in this series, even if they lose the second one like they did. The bad news for the Blackhawks, I think it does have to come down to Corey Crawford. I said he had an okay game during Game 1, even though he still let in 4 goals. But here tonight, letting in 6, not particularly good. A couple of these goals were maybe a bit shaky. Corey Crawford definitely having to improve. The Blackhawks actually came into this playoffs, or they came into this season with a sort of goalie tandem that was going to work out. They had Robin Lehner, but it seemed as though they were trying to sell coming up to the deadline a bit, and so they didn't necessarily need Robin Lehner as a backup, so they traded him over to the Vegas Golden Knights. But all of a sudden, the Blackhawks found themselves actually in the playoffs, and now they do not really have much of an option compared to many of the other teams in these play-ins at the moment. I mean, taking a look at the Oilers, they've got Smith and Koskinen. The Flames have Talbot and Rittich. There are a lot of teams here that have 2 capable goaltenders. The Blackhawks are not one of them, and so they're Malcolm Subba's not terrible, but really, realistically, the Blackhawks are not one of them, and so they're really going to have to ride with Corey Crawford, and right now, letting in 10 goals over 2 games is not the best look. Now, the Blackhawks defense is not doing him any favors, but still, he does need to be better if the Blackhawks want a chance here. Going to my predictions, I had said that the Hurricanes were going to win in 5 games. It's looking a lot more like it could end up just being a clean sweep for them. So while I will be correct in who wins, I probably gave the Rangers a bit too much credit. In the second series, I had the Jets in 4 games, and that is still technically a possibility. And I do feel somewhat confident in the fact that if the Jets hadn't really gotten so heavily injured, they could have potentially closed this series out in 4, but it is still technically something that is alive and still possible. For the Penguins versus the Canadiens, I had the Penguins in 4. I'm actually still relatively confident in that. It's possible that Carey Price manages to steal another game and potentially even 2 games if we want to be very optimistic, but I would say it's more likely the Penguins can close out this series. And then finally, I had the Oilers in 5 games, and honestly, that actually could very well still happen here. It seems to be very much up in the air, a coin toss, which team is going to be able to win, because it's just so open on the ice. And I guess we'll continue watching, because that is, as I said, probably the most fun series thus far. Class dismissed.